Hello, Lisa here. Welcome to Walking the Self-Worth Path, a series where I share with you my favorite tarot and witchy tools, techniques, and rituals to support your journey to an empowered life. Shadow work is one of the toughest parts of walking the self-worth path, and that is a term that I use fairly loosely to define all of the work that we do on ourselves to look at the stuff that we'd really rather probably not look at, or the things that we have sort of forgotten about or hidden away or just have locked up inside of ourselves. Sometimes working with the shadow illuminates something good about yourself or a positive quality that you've suppressed to make other people around you more comfortable. Sometimes the shadow illuminates neutral qualities, things that don't necessarily have a bad or a good connotation, but that for whatever reason, again, have been hidden or suppressed in you. And sometimes the shadow illuminates, or when we look at the shadow, we find things that we don't love about ourselves, things that make us feel bad about ourselves, maybe thought patterns, behaviors, habits, anything that we would rather people maybe not know about us, right? Things are our side that we're maybe not as proud of. And because these things seem to be things that we don't want to look at in general, it's helpful to me to work with cards, to work with crystals, to work with any tool that's going to help me shine a light into those dark places within myself. I really enjoy doing shadow work with decks that are very confronting, that are going to help me see those things I maybe don't want to see. And so you'll see in my previous video where I was talking about the decks and the books that I like to work with for shadow work, you'll notice that a lot of those decks had a very dark overtone or intense overtone to them. However, today I'm going to be sharing with you some of my favorite spreads for doing this work, or at least beginning the conversation with yourself. And for today, I'm going to show you kind of those spreads with a couple different decks, one of which is meant to kind of hold your hand through the process, and one of which is meant to help you acknowledge your feelings. So I'm going to flip the camera around and we're going to take a look at a few spreads to help you dive into your own shadow, and some of my favorite crystals that you can use to boost that work, to support that work if working with crystals is a practice that resonates for you. So first, let's talk about some of my favorite crystals to support uncovering the shadow, to sort of hold your hand and or give you the kick in the butt that you need. The first of these that I want to talk about is fairly easy to find, commonly available, and inexpensive generally to get at least a small piece of it, and that is smoky quartz. Now this is a really beautiful smoky quartz point that I really enjoy because I find that you can see through it really well, and it's a very even tone. It's just a crystal I really enjoy, and it comes to an incredibly sharp point. Now, I have worked with smoky quartz in all kinds of shapes and sizes, from tumbled stones to large clusters. I have quite a big chunk as well that I like to work with, but when it comes to something just to hold an intention while I do a particular kind of work around the shadow, this is one that I really like going to. Now, smoky quartz is one of those crystals that I feel like does a really, really good job of sort of helping you to both illuminate and embrace your shadow. We can look at the beauty of the smoky quartz and recognize that part of its beauty is in the fact that it doesn't have that perfect crystal clear clarity that a regular or clear crystal quartz does. I shouldn't say regular. But in a way, there's something to be particularly embraced and loved about the shadow within the smoky quartz. So I think it's just symbolically a really great reminder of the beauty of the shadow. Now, another crystal that I really like working with when I'm doing shadow work is the Apache tear. Now, if you've never seen an Apache tear, it looks a lot like smoky quartz. It's a black stone, but what's interesting about Apache tear is that when you hold it, it looks incredibly opaque. Like this does not look like it's see-through at all. But when you put a light behind it, hopefully you can see that. I don't want to put it right above the flame. I'm trying to put it in front of the flame. But you can see that beautiful glow coming through. And if you hold an Apache tear up to your eye with a light behind it, you can really see that it's got that same sort of shadowy quality as the smoky quartz. Now, Apache tear is said to be specifically really helpful with holding space for difficult emotion, things like sadness and grief and loss and that sort of thing. But I find that one of the most important facets of shadow work is acknowledging your emotional landscape, right? Like making space to feel and experience your emotions. And so for that, I find Apache tear to be an incredibly supportive stone. Finally, lastly, I should say, for just keeping it simple, one of my really multi-purpose crystals is labradorite. Now, this is a gorgeous labradorite palm stone that I found at a gem show some many years ago. This is probably my favorite piece of labradorite, which is why I brought it to show you. However, when it comes to doing shadow work, this isn't actually the piece I'll typically work with. But before I get into that, let me just tell you a little bit about labradorite. So labradorite was I think originally discovered in Labrador, Canada, and it is a really excellent stone for essentially helping you to shut up your inner critic. In fact, labradorite and a lot of the feldspar family is really good for sort of combating that sort of negative self-talk. There are other stones within this family, particularly dravite as well as larvikite, that are also really good in this realm. So if you have any of those pieces, they're all really good for this. But I find labradorite with the magic in it, it just, to me, it's like, no, I can think positive. Like I don't have to give my inner critic the opportunity to take over. And so I call this stone, or one of the things I call this stone, I use it for many purposes, but for this purpose, I call it the inner critic shutter upper. And that is labradorite. Now, when I'm doing shadow work, this is typically not the piece I'm working with unless I really want to be holding it a lot. But if I'm just going to have it out in my space, I actually really like working with this piece. It's got a little bit less flash, but as you can see, this is actually carved to look like a goddess, like a mother goddess with a little babe right there in front. And so there's something very comforting and reassuring about this particular piece. So not only is it a nice size, but I just love that it's carved into that goddessy shape. It just kind of reminds me to be kind to myself, to mother myself. Now, that's obviously very specifically unique, but in general, any piece of labradorite, particularly any piece that has that bit of flash in it, whatever color the flash is, even just a little bit of flash. It's that spark of magic. It's that spark of hope. It's kind of reminds me of a star in the sky or the northern lights or anything else that gives you that feeling of like uplift, right? Which I think is really, really helpful when you're doing shadow work. I'll leave this guy out here too. So let's grab out the couple of decks that we're going to be talking about while we work through our spreads. So I've pulled out my Mons Tarot because this is probably the #1 deck I reach for when I'm feeling tender or vulnerable in some way, and shadow work is nothing if not vulnerable. So the Mons Tarot is just a really great deck. Any deck that sort of makes you feel safe, that gives you that kind of like hug feeling, can be really, really useful for shadow work, especially if you're just getting started. Those more confronting decks that I definitely recommend when you're really into this work, those confronting decks are really good if you're having a hard time seeing anything you need to work on or anything you need to illuminate. But if you know that there's some stuff lurking in there, especially really challenging or difficult stuff, sometimes what you need is a deck like this, something that's going to kind of hold your hand. If you're unfamiliar with the Mons Tarot, hi, how are you? My name's Lisa. Welcome to my channel, because you've probably not been here before if you've never heard me talk about this deck. I talk about it a lot, but the Mons Tarot is essentially my soul deck. What I really like about the Mons Tarot, it's very like Rider-Waite-Smith clone, but it also has just a really smart way of showing all of the images. It goes its own way in some places, and then in others, it's just essentially just like the Rider-Waite-Smith. But the bright colors and these playful monsters, one of the things that I think makes this such a useful deck for this kind of work is that you're not in your own life, right? This doesn't depict our regular everyday world. This depicts a bunch of monsters, creatures from another dimension, however you want to look at it. And because of that, there's a little bit of distance in this deck. And that can be really, really lovely if what you really need is to look at some confronting stuff, because you're not right in the image, right? It's not so in your face. By contrast, the other deck I'm going to share with you, I feel like it's very easy to see yourself in every single image, so it's a lot more close. Now this, I didn't have this at the time that I filmed my previous video, decks that I recommend for shadow work, but this is definitely, man, right up there on this list. This is the Reclaim Oracle. This was a deck that I backed on Kickstarter, and she has sold out of the original Kickstarter printing, but at the time I'm filming this, she is currently taking pre-orders for the next printing. The reason that this deck is so useful for this kind of work, oh, whoa, we're flying away, is because there's a lot of emotion present in the cards. The way the images are depicted, along with the keywords, like here we have loss, and she's holding like a ghost, like holding onto something that's no longer there. They're visceral. They're very emotive. You can really feel what the character in the card is feeling, particularly if you tend to be somebody who is very triggered in it, like triggered. Let me be careful how I use that word. If you're somebody who's very, sparked by imagery, if imagery is something that you really find just pokes at you a little bit, then this deck will poke at you, and I think help you to acknowledge some of the difficult things that maybe are hard to acknowledge without that little nudge. So this deck is like a great place to start if you're just starting and you don't know what your shadow work experience is going to be like. This deck is kind of like at the other end of the spectrum, or if you know you've got work to do around healing, if you know you've got to look at some really intense stuff. Now, as always, whenever we're talking about shadow work or this kind of thing, it's really important to remember that everybody is going to be up for or at a different space when it comes to this kind of work. Do not be afraid to step back from this work, to not do it on your own. In general, this is the kind of thing that is definitely helped by working with somebody like a qualified mental health professional, particularly if you feel like you're going to be facing some actual triggers around trauma, or if anything bubbles up for you that feels too big for you to handle on your own. Never ever hesitate to reach out. That is one of the beautiful and powerful ways to do shadow work, is to work with a therapist, a counselor, that sort of thing. So don't ever shy away from that if that feels right for you. But with that being said, I'm going to stop babbling and we're going to look at our couple of spreads. So we're going to start with just one about how to dip your toe in. This first spread is basically to help you just barely tiptoe, right? To figure out what it is that you're going to do, maybe what that's going to feel like. So there are 3 card positions in each of the spreads I'm going to share with you today. The first spread, here are our positions. So what about shadow work scares me is the first position. The second position is what about shadow work excites me? And the third position is how am I going to get the most out of the journey? Or how can I get the most out of the journey? So what scares me about shadow work? What excites me about shadow work? And how can I get the most out of the journey? So in this example, or this sample spread, I've drawn the 8 of Pentacles for what scares me about shadow work. And wow, how apt is that? The 8 of Pentacles is a card about work. It's often about a kind of drudgery style of work. Not always, but the kind of work where we have to do a lot of repetitive tasks to get better at something. And shadow work is one of those things that once you sort of open that sort of Pandora's box of personal growth work, you are sort of in it, right? You are sort of committed to seeing it through in some way or another. And it's not something as simple as, okay, I'm going to flip a few cards and then I'm done now, right? It's like you're beginning a process, and that process is going to require a lot of dipping in again and again and again. I often say that once you start this work, it's like you never quite reach a final destination, right? This is the kind of work, just like walking the self-worth path, this is the kind of work where you're going to do the same thing and work on the same kind of stuff over and over and over again. Only each time it's going to be just a little different. You're going to have grown a little more. You're going to have evolved a little more. You're going to have reached a new level of confidence each time you approach the same issue, the same part of your shadow. So the 8 of Pentacles, I think, is like, of course it's scary. It's scary to know that when we dive into this work, we're kind of committing to a journey. We're not just like saying, okay, I'm going to do a thing and then go about my day. It's not always that simple. But what excites me about shadow work, and we have the World card. Look at her. She's so cute. The World is definitely a card that's like, okay, well, it excites me to be able to bring my pieces back together. I mean, what is the world if not that sense of completion and cohesion? We're fragmented in a way, all of us, right? We have all tucked parts of ourselves away where they're safe or where we don't have to confront them or look at them. The world, what's exciting about shadow work is the idea that you can bring those pieces of yourself together. You can actually start to stitch those pieces back into yourself. The visual I had when I said that was of like Peter Pan and his shadow and like trying to stitch his shadow back on or attach it with soap or whatever, and it had to be sewn back on. That's kind of what shadow work really is all about, right? It's this idea that we can bring our pieces back together. Some would see echoes of this same kind of work in the kind of shamanic work where you're retrieving your soul pieces. There's different ways to look at it, but that's very exciting about shadow work, that we could become more complete, more whole, more cohesive. I love that. So that makes total sense to me. And in the third position, how can I get the most out of the journey? And I have the Chariot. Well, what a great card is that? These are actually landing very spot on. The Chariot is about staying focused on where it is you're trying to get to. What is the why? Why are you doing shadow work? What in your life are you trying to improve? What are you trying to heal? Where are you trying to evolve to? And keeping that in mind so that it's your will that drives you forward. That's how you can get the most out of a shadow work journey. So I would encourage you to try this with your own deck of cards, whatever cards you like to work with, whatever ones feel like they're going to support you in just trying it and seeing what comes through. But what scares me about shadow work, what excites me, and how can I get the most out of the journey? It's a simple spread, but it's a great way to get started. All right, so for the next spread, I'm going to go ahead and pull in the Reclaim Oracle. So this spread is in part the real meat of shadow work. And I've talked about this sort of 3-part method, or at least I talk about it in the book. I think I may have talked about it in one of the other videos I did, but right now I can't remember. But there are 3 primary steps, in my opinion and experience, to a basic personal shadow work practice. The first step is to observe. To observe what it is that you're doing, your patterns of behavior, to recognize those things that you may want to illuminate, that you may want to grow out of, old coping mechanisms that no longer serve you, that kind of thing. And then the second step is to own it, to take responsibility for it, to recognize that this is part of you, to integrate that into yourself in whatever way that you can. And finally, to create conscious change where you want to change. So let's use the example for this spread of, this is a very light and fluffy kind of thing, but let's use nail biting, right? So that's a habit. So actually, no, we can't do that because we want to observe first. Hold on, let me pull back. Okay, so let's say for this particular spread, we don't know what's in the shadow. We don't know what it is we may want to work on. So this is going to help you pick one thing to look at and one thing to maybe address in your shadow. So these cards are hopefully going to help us do that. Let's just pull our 3 card positions here. All right. So first we have observe. So what is it that we need to look at in our shadow? And check this out. The card we've pulled is confidence. So that right there tells me, okay, my confidence is hidden in the shadow, right? I'm not comfortable being confident. There's something about that. I tend to be small. I tend to shrink myself to make other people more comfortable. My confidence is not something that comes easily to me, right? It's something that I've disconnected from in some way. So the next step is, how can I own that? Rage. Ooh, that's interesting. So in this case, rage could be a cue that I need to own the reason why I felt small, the reason I feel like it's almost safer to feel small. Why did I maybe originally hide my confidence away? What experiences might I have had in my life? And again, keep in mind, this is what I feel ready for exploring, right? You may pull this card and be like, okay, I'm going to nope out of that. That's too much for me today. And that's completely okay. You can stop right at confidence and just meditate on that. You don't have to keep going, right? But if you pull a card like this and you feel comfortable and you feel safe and you feel ready to explore what this could mean for you, you can dive in and go, okay, how can I own my confidence? What stopped me from owning my confidence? So this is the own position. So first is observing, what is the thing that we're looking at? Second is owning it. How can I somehow take responsibility for it? How do I integrate it? How do I bring it out of the shadow and bring it into myself, right? And the third card, or the third position, is how to create conscious change. So this is sort of an acknowledgement step. This is a noticing step. This is an acknowledging step. The third step is sort of an action step. What can I do to do things differently, to integrate, to bring confidence into the light from the shadow? And we have peace. Peace. And in this context, particularly when I see rage being the key for how to own it, how to take responsibility for it in a way, peace tells me that perhaps some self-forgiveness is needed here. Perhaps the anger is not at others, but at the self. How can I look at that and then release that? How can I perhaps practice some self-forgiveness? Or how can I come to a place where I can feel at peace with the experiences that caused me to hide away that confidence? So as you can see, it's only 3 cards, but it's very meaty. And of course, something that you could do is for each of these cards, once you've pulled your primary card, you could pull a 3-card spread beneath that, right? Like to explore further, or clarifying tarot card. You can do these with this spread with any sort of deck. You can use it with an oracle deck that you feel like has enough of a range of cards or themes in it to do this work. You could do it with a tarot deck. Here I've done it with the Reclaim Oracle. But hopefully that gives you an idea of how the observe, own, and create conscious change spread works. Finally, let's keep this deck for the third one. So the third one is about addressing a habit. So let's say we want to look at, as part of our shadow work, what is a negative habit that we may want to change. So this is going to help us do that. Again, just 3 card positions. Let's give it a shuffle and we'll pull 3 and I'll walk you through the spread. Okay. Position 1. What is the negative habit that I want to address right now or look at? What is a negative habit I should be taking a peek at? Here we have blame. Like, how perfect is this deck for this work, by the way? So here we have blame. Okay, how am I caught up in the blame game? How am I pointing the finger at others? Let's take a look at that. This is just helping me to identify what is it that I want to work on, okay? The second card is, why is this a crutch? Why is this a crutch? Integrity. Integrity. So you could look at integrity and go, oh, well, it's a crutch because I feel really strongly that, people should behave in a right way. And when they don't, I feel like harsh about that. I feel judgmental about that. I get really intense about that because I hold myself to such a high standard and I expect others to live up to that same high standard. So that's one way I could look at this combination of cards, right? And then the third position is basically do this instead. So instead of blaming, what do I do instead? Grief. Oh, so here's where we pull out our Apache tier, right? Because here this is basically saying that if we want to blame less, right? If we want to judge less, if we want to stop pointing the finger at others and be able to really just like pull back from that behavior, then we need to be able to let our own emotion in. We need to let our own disappointment in when people don't behave the way that we want. We need to let our own feelings about that in. We need to be able to process that experience. Grief is about feeling, right? Letting it in, letting the emotion in. And again, there could be other layers to this depending on your life experiences and what these cards trigger for you personally. But this is essentially how it works, right? What is the habit I need to look at or should look at right now? Why is that habit a crutch? Why is that something I lean into? Why is it a coping mechanism, perhaps? That could be something to look at. And then what can I do instead? What can I do instead of blaming? Oh, okay, I can feel the sadness. I can feel whatever I'm feeling. I can stop projecting maybe my issues of myself onto others, things like that, right? So it can really help you take a look at yourself and look at your behaviors. These spreads are intense, I'm not gonna lie, and they may not be for everybody. So I really want to encourage you when you watch videos like this, mine, anybody else's, it doesn't matter. Really important to check things that you hear, especially on YouTube, right? Really check things that you hear against what feels right and what feels safe for you. You always know you the best. And I think that's really important to remember. Nobody out there is the expert on you. You're the expert on you, right? You might want somebody to help nudge you along, or you might want a tip or a trick to sort of dive into that work, but ultimately you're the one in charge and you're the one that gets to decide what you do, when you do it, how much of it you do. And even in a spread like that, it's a simple 3-card spread. But if you pull that first card and you're like, nope, you pick up your cards, you walk away. Zero judgment in that. There is nothing wrong with that whatsoever. A middle ground to that might be you pull a card, you feel like it's really intense, snap a quick photo of it or write it down in your journal and then put it away. You can come back to it later when you feel ready. You can come back to it when you have a support system in place. You can come back to it with a trusted loved one or, again, a mental health professional, and you can parse it with them. You do not have to do this work by yourself, and there's no medal for doing it by yourself. I did a lot of this work by myself, but certainly not all of it. And I think it's important to recognize where those limits are and just trust yourself. That's the most important piece. And let's face it, for a lot of us, self-trust is lurking in the shadow. Self-trust is something that we've hidden away. It's something we're not really comfortable with at the moment, and that's okay too. But as much as possible, remind yourself that you are the authority of you, period, full stop. All right, you guys, thank you so much for hanging out with me. It's really been a really fun journey so far to take you along with me along the self-worth path. As a reminder, my book, The Self-Worth Path, is available on Amazon. I will have a link to that down below. I do, of course, dive into all of these topics with a lot more depth in the book. The book is not about tarot or about witchcraft. It is about literally the work of self-worth and finding yourself and embracing yourself and completing yourself in your own way. Thank you again so much, and may your magic always shine from the inside out. Bye, guys.